In the spring of 1927, the water that broke the levees along the lower Mississippi did not simply flood the bottomlands of eastern Arkansas, it rearranged them. Fields that had been farmed for 2 generations came up under 6, 8, sometimes 15 feet of brown water, and when that water finally pulled back in the early summer months, it did not leave the ground the way it found it. Along a stretch of bottom near the confluence of the St. Francis and the Mississippi, in what was then Mississippi County, a tenant farmer named Elias Renfro walked out onto ground his family had worked since before the war and found that the flood had carried away 4 feet of topsoil in a single season. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What it left behind was not mud. It was stone, laid in courses, running in a straight line for a distance Renfro paced off at roughly 90 feet, before it disappeared again, under a fresh drift of silt. He did not report it to a university. There was no university within reach that would have taken the call of a tenant farmer in a flood year. He reported it to the man who held his lease, and that man, 3 weeks later, mentioned it to a levee engineer working for the Army Corps of Engineers, and that is the only reason any of this survived past the summer of 1927 at all. The lower Mississippi Delta was not empty ground before the flood came through it, and it was not empty ground for the 1,000 years before that either. The bottomlands of eastern Arkansas sit inside what archaeologists now call the Central Mississippi Valley, a region that supported some of the largest earthwork complexes north of Mexico. Mound centers rose along the river terraces for centuries, built by farming societies with organized labor, long-distance trade in copper and marine shell, and a settlement pattern dense enough that early surveyors sometimes mistook one mound group for the edge of another 5 miles off. The Quapaw, who occupied the lower valley when French traders first arrived in the 17th century, carried their own account of the land before them, an account that spoke of towns swallowed by the river's shifting course, and of older peoples whose names had not survived the crossing between languages. Elders interviewed by early ethnographers described a time before the Quapaw's own arrival in the valley, when other towns stood along the river's edge and were taken, not by war, but by the river changing its mind about where it wanted to run. 19th century collectors dug through dozens of mound sites for saleable relics long before anyone photographed a stratigraph or recorded a context, and by the time the Bureau of American Ethnology sent surveyors into Arkansas in the 1880s under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, entire complexes had already been leveled for cotton. The engraved shell fragment Renfro pulled from the flood mud would, decades later, become one small piece of a much larger and better documented pattern. Marine shell, worked into cups, gorgets and beads, moved along river and overland routes from the Gulf Coast into the interior of the continent for centuries before European contact, carried hand to hand and community to community across distances that would take a modern hiker weeks to cover on foot. Archaeologists studying this exchange network across the wider Mississippian world have traced shell from Gulf sources as far north as the Great Lakes and as far west as the Central Plains, evidence of an economy of prestige goods that operated on a continental scale long before any road connected those regions. Renfro's fragment, with its nested engraved lines, was never compared against the published catalogue of known shell gorget styles from the region, because it never left his cigar box long enough for anyone qualified to make that comparison. Renfro himself never claimed to know what the engraving meant. He described it to Pruitt only as lines that curved back on themselves the way a snake does when it is startled, a comparison Pruitt recorded exactly as he gave it, without embellishment, in a notebook otherwise full of far taller tales from far less careful witnesses. What the object represented, whether a piece of that broader trade network or something entirely outside it, is a question nobody has been in a position to answer. What the Bureau's survey confirmed, against the popular theory of a vanished race of mound builders distinct from Native Americans, was that these were the works of ancestral native peoples. That conclusion closed one argument and opened no appetite for a second one. Once the mound builder question was declared settled, Funding for further excavation in the Arkansas bottoms thinned to almost nothing, and it stayed thin for the better part of 4 decades. Surveyors who did pass through the lower valley in those years worked from the high terraces outward, mapping the mounds that stood visible above the floodplain and rarely testing the low bottom ground beneath them, ground that was farmed every season and considered agriculturally productive rather than archaeologically promising. This meant that in 1927, when a flood tore the topsoil off a stretch of ground nobody had ever formally surveyed, there was no institutional structure in place ready to look closely at what it exposed, and no funding line under which such a look could easily be justified, even if someone had wanted to take it. The Levee engineer who came out to Renfro's ground in July of 1927 was a young man named Harold Beckwith, on loan from the Corps of Engineers Memphis district to assess levee failure points along the St. Francis Basin. Beckwith's job had nothing to do with archaeology. He was there to measure scour depth and recommend repair specifications, but Beckwith had studied geology for 2 years before the war interrupted his schooling, and when Renfro walked him out to the exposed stonework, he recognized immediately that it did not match anything in the local sediment record. The stone was not native to the alluvial bottom. The nearest comparable material lay in outcrops more than 60 miles to the west, in the Ozark foothills, which meant that whoever laid this course had moved work stone across 60 miles of river bottom without benefit of a road, a rail line, or a draft animal suited to the task, using methods the historical record does not describe for this stretch of the valley at any known period. Beckwith paced the exposed line and recorded it in his field notebook as running true north to within 2 degrees for its full 90 feet, squared at both visible ends, with a face dressed smooth on the exposed side and left rough on the buried side, a construction detail that told him this had been a wall meant to be seen from one direction only. Beneath the wall's base course, the flood scour had also cut into a layer of ash and burned clay nearly a foot thick, the kind of deposit that forms only from repeated, sustained burning over a very long occupation, not a single fire. Renfro told him the ash layer ran on past where the wall ended, further than either man had time to trace before the light gave out that evening. Beckwith took photographs with a Corps-issued box camera, made a sketch map, and sent both, along with a 2-page written report, to his district office with a recommendation that the Corps notify the Smithsonian before authorizing any repair work that would disturb the site further. He came back a second time, 4 days later, on his own time rather than the Corps' clock, and paced off an additional 40 feet of the wall's line, where a second, smaller flood channel had cut a fresh exposure a short distance downstream. That second visit is recorded only in his personal notebook, not in any official Corps document, because by then his supervisor had already told him the repair schedule would not be delayed for it. What happened to Beckwith's recommendation is documented only in fragments, because the full file no longer exists in any public archive. The Memphis District's correspondence log for August of 1927 shows an entry recording that Beckwith's report was forwarded to Washington on the 14th of that month. The Smithsonian's own accession records for that period show no corresponding entry for a site in Mississippi County, Arkansas, submitted in 1927. Either the report never reached the institution it was addressed to, or it reached someone who declined to log it, and in a flood year, with levee repair funding under enormous pressure and 100 more urgent claims on every engineer's attention, a stone wall under a cotton field was not going to compete for anyone's time. Beckwith's own recommendation to hold off on repair work was overruled within the month. The Corps rebuilt the levee section on schedule, using local fill dredged from the immediate area, and the repair crews buried the exposed wall under 11 feet of new levee embankment before the end of September. Whatever else lay beneath that stretch of bottom went back into the ground it had briefly come out of, and this time it went under engineered fill instead of alluvial silt, which meant it was buried more thoroughly than the river itself had ever managed to bury it. Beckwith left the Corps 2 years later for private engineering work in Memphis and, according to a grandson who still has the original field notebook, spoke about the wall only rarely, and always with the same complaint: that a stretch of the most unusual masonry he had ever measured in 15 years of fieldwork had gone back under the ground with less paperwork than a routine culvert repair. Renfro did not let the matter drop the way the Corps did. He kept what he called his flood pieces in a cigar box for the rest of his life, a handful of items the water had carried up alongside the stonework before the repair crews arrived. A fragment of worked shell with an engraved design he could not identify, 3 pieces of pottery tempered with crushed mussel shell in a style unlike anything made locally within his memory, and one object that troubled him more than the rest, a small cast object of a metal he described in a letter to his son as heavier than lead, but not the color of any lead he had handled. He never had it tested. He did not trust anyone connected to the Corps or the county extension office to give him a straight answer, not after watching his own report disappear into Beckwith's file and out the other side of it. What he did instead, sometime in the 1930s, was describe the wall and the ash layer and the cigar box items to a folklorist named Vera Doss Pruitt, who was collecting oral histories and local legend material across the Arkansas Delta for a project connected to the Federal Writers Project. Pruitt recorded Renfro's account by hand in a field notebook, alongside dozens of other stories she gathered that decade, most of them ghost stories and flood tales with no material evidence behind them at all. Renfro's account was different, and she noted as much in the margin of her own notebook, writing that this was the only story in her collection where the teller could still produce the objects he described. Pruitt asked to photograph the cigar box contents for her files, and did, though the photographs themselves were lost sometime after her death, when the bulk of her personal papers passed through 2 more households before finally reaching an archive. What survives is her written description, careful and specific in a way that suggests she took the account more seriously than most of the material she was collecting that season, describing the shell fragments engraving as a set of nested lines she could not match to any pattern she had seen published from other valley sites, and noting Renfro's insistence that the metal object had come from a spot directly beneath the wall's base course rather than from the surrounding fill. Pruitt's field notebooks eventually passed, after her death, into the hands of a regional historical society in northeast Arkansas, where they sat uncatalogued in a donated collection for decades. It was not a professional archaeologist who eventually connected Renfro's account back to Beckwith's buried Corps report, but an amateur historian named Curtis Aldeman, working through the Historical Society's boxes in the 1980s while researching an unrelated project on Levee construction history. Aldeman found Pruitt's transcription of the Renfro interview first, then went looking for any Corps of Engineers correspondence from the same stretch of river in the same year, and located Beckwith's forwarded report reference in the Memphis District's old correspondence log, still catalogued under levee maintenance rather than any archaeological heading, which is very likely the reason it had never been cross-referenced with anything else in nearly 60 years. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Alderman's own background made him an unlikely person to succeed, where trained researchers had not. He worked as a bookkeeper for a farm supply company and pursued local history only in the evenings, largely self-taught, with no institutional affiliation that might have opened doors a private citizen's letters could not. What he had, instead, was patience and a willingness to sit with 2 unrelated collections, a folklorist's field notebook and a levee engineer's correspondence log, until the connection between them became obvious in a way it apparently had not been to anyone paid to look for it. He kept copies of everything he sent and everything he received, a habit that turned out to matter more than he could have known at the time, since it is his personal file, not any official government record, that now constitutes the clearest surviving proof that both the wall and the request to investigate it further were real. Aldeman wrote to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey in 1987, describing what he had found and requesting that someone consider a subsurface survey of the buried levee section. The survey's reply, which Aldeman kept and later gave to a regional archive, states that without ground-penetrating radar funding allocated for the site, and without landowner permission from the levee district that now controlled the ground, a formal investigation was not feasible at that time. Aldeman wrote a second letter the following year, offering to help secure landowner permission himself, since the family farming the ground above the buried section were friends of his from church. The survey's second reply thanked him for the offer and noted that even with permission secured, no field season in the coming 2 years had budget allocated for a site with no formal accession number and no confirmed cultural affiliation. No funding was allocated in the years that followed. No permission was sought. The Levee section, built in 1927, still stands today, reinforced and widened twice since, carrying a county road along its crown. And the wall Harold Beckwith photographed and measured in July of that year has not been seen by another human being since the repair crews closed the ground over it. What Renfro's cigar box held did eventually get examined, though not until 1994, when his granddaughter, an elementary school teacher named Alma Renfro Pace, brought the surviving items to a visiting materials analyst connected with a university extension program doing a public outreach event at the county fair. The pottery and the shell fragment were consistent with the broader Mississippian tradition of the region, unremarkable enough on their own that the analyst filed only a brief note. The cast metal object was a different matter. A portable X-ray fluorescence test, run informally and without full laboratory documentation because the equipment on hand was intended for pottery temper analysis rather than metallurgy, returned a composition dominated by copper, alloyed with a measurable percentage of tin, consistent with a true bronze rather than the native copper worked cold by Mississippian smiths across the rest of the archaeological record. Native copper working is well documented across this period, hammered and annealed from naturally occurring metal rather than smelted or alloyed. Deliberate bronze alloying, at any meaningful scale, is not documented at all for this culture in this region, and no comparable object has been formally reported from a controlled excavation anywhere in the Mississippi Valley for this era. The analyst recommended the object be sent to a proper metallurgical lab for confirmation and offered to make the arrangements himself through a colleague at a state university 2 hours away. Alma Pace, by her own later account, grew uneasy, watching a stranger handle her grandfather's cigar box items with the kind of interest that made her think of everything Elias Renfro had told her about reports that vanished and land that got buried twice as deep the second time. She thanked the analyst, took the box home, and never submitted the object for further testing. She told a cousin some years afterward that she had decided the object had already cost her grandfather enough peace of mind for one family, and she did not see the sense in handing it to another institution only to watch it disappear the way his own report had. It remains, as far as anyone outside her family knows, in a private collection that has never been catalogued by any accredited institution. What the ash layer beneath Beckwith's wall represents has never been directly dated, because no one has taken a sample from it since 1927. But the depth and density he recorded, combined with what is known generally about occupation deposits of this kind in the valley, suggests a span of sustained use running to several centuries at minimum, on ground that sits below the elevation at which most known Mississippian mound centers in the region were built. Mound builders in this valley generally chose ground high enough to sit above ordinary flood stage, which was itself a hard-won piece of engineering knowledge developed over generations of watching the river take lower ground. A wall and an extended occupation layer sitting on ground low enough that the 1897 flood, and again the 1927 flood, could scour 4 feet of soil off it in a single season, implies either an older phase of settlement, before that flood knowledge had been fully established across the valley, or a structure built for a purpose that required proximity to the water regardless of the risk, a landing, a boundary marker, a ceremonial ground meant to be periodically claimed and released by the river itself. No excavation has ever tested which explanation fits, because no excavation has ever reached the wall again. Interest in the site did not end with Aldeman's 2 unanswered letters. In 2009, a graduate student researching Delta flood history came across Aldeman's donated correspondence in the same Historical Society collection, and working from Beckwith's original coordinates as best she could reconstruct them from his sketch map, requested access to a set of airborne LIDAR survey data the state had recently commissioned for flood modeling purposes along that stretch of the St. Francis Basin. LIDAR can, under the right conditions, detect subtle variations in surface elevation caused by buried structures even beneath modern engineered fill, though the resolution needed to confirm something as specific as a 90-foot wall depends heavily on how the fill itself was compacted at the time. The dataset showed what the student's advisor described in a brief unpublished memo as a faint linear anomaly running roughly along the axis Beckwith had recorded, consistent with, though not proof of, a buried feature beneath the levee's landward toe. The memo recommended a targeted ground-penetrating radar survey to confirm or rule out the anomaly. The recommendation went once again unfunded, this time for reasons that had less to do with institutional disinterest than with the Levee district's understandable reluctance to authorize any subsurface work on an active flood control structure without a compelling reason the district's own engineers found persuasive, and a faint anomaly on a LIDAR scan did not clear that bar. The graduate student, whose name appears in the Historical Society's visitor log only as a first initial and a last name, Reeves, did not let the matter end there either. She spent the better part of a year afterward trying to locate any surviving copy of Beckwith's original 2-page report, working through the National Archives regional branch in Fort Worth, which holds a portion of the Corps of Engineers' Memphis district records for this period. What she found was a gap. The correspondence log entry from August of 1927 survives, listing the report by date and subject line, but the report itself is absent from the corresponding folder, one of a small number of gaps in an otherwise well-preserved collection. An archivist she corresponded with suggested the folder may simply have been misfiled during a 1950s reorganization of the district's older records, a mundane explanation that Reeves found plausible and unsatisfying in roughly equal measure, because a misfiled folder and a folder someone removed on purpose leave exactly the same gap behind them, and nothing in the archive can tell you which one you are looking at. What remains of Beckwith's find, beyond the correspondence log entry and his grandson's memory of the notebook, is a single photostat copy of one of his original box camera photographs, reproduced in a 1941 Corps of Engineers internal newsletter article about levee construction techniques in the St. Francis Basin, used there only as an illustration of pre-repair ground conditions with no caption identifying what the masonry in the background actually was. The article's author, whoever wrote the caption, either did not know what the photograph showed or did not think it worth mentioning, and either way, that single reproduced image is now the only surviving photographic evidence of the wall, since Beckwith's own prints and negatives were lost when his grandson's house in Memphis flooded during a storm in the 1980s, a small and almost unbearably fitting irony for a discovery that owed its entire existence to one flood, and very nearly owed its final disappearance to another. Reeves eventually left academic archaeology for a career in historic preservation work unrelated to the Delta, but she kept a copy of her correspondence with the Levee district and the National Archives in a personal file, the same way Aldeman had kept his. And in 2019 she shared that file with a small regional History Society newsletter that ran a short, largely overlooked article on the case, under the heading of Unsolved Local Mysteries rather than Archaeology, which meant it reached almost none of the readers who might have known what to do with it. The newsletter's editor later said the response to the piece was modest, a handful of letters from readers who remembered hearing some version of the Renfro story second-hand from relatives, none of whom had anything new to add beyond confirming that the story had circulated quietly in that corner of the county for most of a century without ever once making its way into a textbook, a museum case, or a peer-reviewed journal. The 1927 flood is remembered today mostly for what it destroyed above ground, the towns it drowned, the levees it broke in more than 145 places along the river system, the roughly 700,000 people it displaced across 7 states. It is remembered far less for what it uncovered, and then allowed to be buried a second time, more permanently than the river itself ever managed. Harold Beckwith's report sits, if it survives at all, in some uncatalogued corner of a federal records depository, filed under levee maintenance rather than archaeology, the same administrative accident that kept it invisible to researchers for 60 years, and may be keeping it invisible still. Vera Doss Pruitt's field notebooks remain in a regional historical society collection that has never received the funding to fully catalogue and digitize its holdings. Curtis Aldeman's correspondence with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey sits in a private file, a paper trail proving the site was identified and confirmed as promising not once but twice, and funded neither time. And Elias Renfro Pace's cigar box, with its shell fragment, its unusual pottery, and its object of alloyed metal that should not exist in this valley at this depth in this period, remains in private hands, untested by any accredited laboratory, unavailable to the researchers who would need to hold it in order to settle the question one way or the other. The levee still runs along that stretch of the St. Francis Basin, carrying its county road, mowed twice a year by a maintenance crew that has no reason to know what lies 11 feet beneath the grass on its landward face. The cotton fields on either side have changed hands several times since Elias Renfro worked them as a tenant, and the current owners, by all available accounts, have never been told what a young Corps engineer photographed there during one flood-soaked summer more than 90 years ago. The wall that ran true north for 90 feet, dressed smooth on one side and rough on the other, faced toward a river that has since shifted its channel more than a mile from where it ran in 1927, so that even the water the wall was built to face is no longer where it used to be. What surfaced when the 1927 flood tore the ground open has gone back under twice now, once beneath the river's own silt and once beneath a federal levee, and nothing about either burial required anyone to make a decision to hide it. It required only that everyone with the authority to look closer had a more urgent reason not to, in a season when the whole valley was underwater and the ground kept giving up more than any single agency had the capacity to receive. The wall is still there, the ash layer is still there. Somewhere in a private house in northeast Arkansas, so is the small, heavy, oddly colored object that a tenant farmer pulled out of the mud before anyone told him to put it back, sitting in a cigar box that has now outlived the man who filled it, the engineer who first measured what it came from, and every institution that was ever given a chance to look closer and chose, for reasons that were never malicious and never quite adequate either, to look away instead. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.